Hi, my name is Tay Moss. I'm going to give a presentation again that I gave last weekend at the American Academy of Religion annual conference that met in Boston. I gave this as part of a panel that was Artificial Intelligence and Religion Unit and the Catholic Studies Unit combined. The theme was Catholic AI, Catholic and Anglican approaches and experiments with AI. So I was fortunate enough to be given the first slot on the roster of speakers, and this is a version of that presentation which I gave. So, all right. First of all, I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. The land where we met in Boston is traditionally the land of the Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, and the Nipmuc people. And I had a little map there to kind of give people some sense of what that looked like pre-contact. And I gave just a very quick little reflection about how, both my organization that I come from, TUCC, and myself are committed to justice making and reconciliation, and how we ought to always keep these folks in mind. All right. So, who am I? Well, if you don't know me, I'm an Episcopal priest. Originally came to the Anglican Church of Canada about 21 years ago. I do a lot of stuff with the combination of church and technology, including media production, church planting, leadership coaching, and development. I started switching more into United Church of Canada side of things in 2020 and joined as well the Association for Leaders in Lifelong Learning for Ministry. So the big project that I do for TUCC is called ChurchX. It is a online learning website portal for seminaries, judicatories, congregations, consultants, basically anybody who wants to create online learning and experiences for people. So the goal was to connect resources with ministry in a digital age. This slide is slightly out of date because we have now more than 12,000 members and about 470 courses or so that we've run on our platform. And as I started to develop technologies for teaching, it was a pretty natural segue into doing more AI kinds of projects. So, who's Cathy? Cathy was a chatbot that we built in cooperation with TriTank, which comes out of Virginia Theological Seminary and my organization, TUCC ChurchX. So that's a lot of organizations, but basically, the idea was that the Episcopal Church's TriTank organization wanted to create a chatbot that could answer questions that were relevant to people making inquiries about the Episcopal Church. And they came to us to create the technology to do that. Later, that has been updated, so Cathy no longer exists. Now it's called Episcobot, and it has some technical infrastructure behind the scenes that have changed and been updated as well. So when I say RAG, RAG, that means Retrieval Augmented Generation. And I'm going to get rid of my camera here so you can see the whole slide deck there. So the idea here is to combine a curated library of resources with a conversational generative AI system, such as um, the website for the Episcopal Church, some publications from the Forward movement, and other stuff as well that they gave us permission to use. I mean, all that information was given with permission. And the idea is to make chatbots that are accurate, domain specific, and have verifiable information. That is, they tell you the sources that they're using to answer your questions. So the way it works is like this. So you have a user. The user asks a question such as, who is the presiding bishop? That's their query. The next stage, we pass that to a retriever. The retriever then searches through a database of Episcopal Church resources and that we have created using an indexing pipeline to retrieve documents that are relevant to this search. So once the retriever gets those documents, it sends them along with the original query to create a new query that goes to an LLM. In this case, we were using ChatGPT 4.1 for most of the responses that we were analyzing, but you can also use Claude in the system, and I've experimented with that, and Gemini as well. So in the end, the question gets answered with the context, the system prompt, and the original prompt of the user, and so they get a response like Bishop Sean Rowe, but they would also see any documents that were linked, that were retrieved as part of the retrieval step as well. So how much usage did this get? Was it useful for people? Short answer, between August 6th and June 23rd, which is the cutoff for this analysis, yes, it got used and quite a bit. So you can see, oops, camera already in use. Let me just get rid of this little thing. Yes, it did get quite a bit of use. The data set that we have here comprises about 12,000 conversations, which between them had about 107,000 messages. Originally, it was posted on a website, askcathy.ai, as well as some churches put it on their websites as a widget. So as a result of that, we have mountains of data, right? And we thought we could do something with that that might be kind of interesting for understanding the nature of these conversations. So the project, which we called internally Sacred in Silicon, was an empirical and theological analysis of AI human interaction in faith conversations. The collaborators for this research included General Theological Seminary, Lilly Foundation Pathways Grant that was received and administered by General Theological Seminary, ChurchX TUCC, which is my organization. We formed a team that consisted of myself, Michael Jailerschmutt, who's faculty at GTS, Aaron Green, who's a researcher in Europe, some Humber students from Humber College here in Toronto who were studying machine learning and artificial intelligence, and some research assistants and interns in the summertime as well. So the goals of the Sacred in Silicon project were, first of all, to answer this question, is learning or spiritual growth happening? What do these conversations reveal about the nature of religious inquiry that's been directed at an AI? So how are these conversations unique from other kinds of conversations people might have with AI? Or how is it different from human-to-human interaction? So could we, knowing how it's different, could we then design generative AI applications to maximize learning and spiritual growth? We know from some other studies that when good pedagogy is combined with these kinds of tools, you can in fact create some pretty awesome learning opportunities. So we want to see that. And then, what methodologies in this research work? When we apply things like natural language processing, topic analysis, sentiment analysis, or, for that matter, dialogue act recognition, conversation visualization, and learning assessment, what do we discover? And what I mean by dialogue act recognition, by the way, is the idea that you can look at turns in a conversation and categorize them. Like, are they a question? Are they an answer to a question? Are they an attempt to direct a conversation or direct a person? Are they just conversational bits and pieces like hello and goodbye, just managing conversation and social cues. So if you know that, you can start to see patterns emerge, and I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So what I did next was I created something called Tase Tools. This is a bespoke software package designed to analyze education chat logs. It was developed by me and some Humber College students. It consists of about 80,000 lines of code. Its core hardware is an old Mac Tower, you see on the lower right-hand corner there, with about 8 CPUs of processing cores. And on top of that, I wiped the original operating system off and I put Unix on it. Sorry, not Unix, Linux on it. And then a bunch of Docker containers that then had an interface for creating data sets, for analyzing them through a job queue, and then producing visualizations and other things. So what can you do with this? Well, first of all, you could obviously manage the chat logs that we had and put them together into different combinations. You could do pre-processing of the text, so things like removing common words if you wanted to, like stop words, like hello, goodbye, things like that. You could do statistical analysis, the size of the conversations, what they're composed of. You could do batch processing using LLMs. So you could ask a question, like you could create a rubric like, does learning occur here? Learning looks like the following things, like somebody saying, I never thought of it that way, which we would characterize as a change of perspective. So you can create a long rubric with different evidences of learning, and then you can just query each individual conversation through LLMs to see if it has evidence of learning. You can do topic analysis, where you take the words that people have, not the words, but the sentences that people have written, and then you encode those into a semantic space, and you see where they cluster, what kinds of topics are being brought up. You can do sentiment analysis, which is an attempt to understand the emotional content that's latent inside the chat logs. So often you can detect emotion by how people talk. Speech act classification, which I described before. Is this a question? Is this an answer? What about contradiction, and so on? And then visualizing the patterns. We could do other things as well, like create these cool little visualizations and of different types, and I'll get into some of these in a minute. So what were our findings? First of all, do people engage with the chatbot? Yes, is the short answer. We didn't see any kind of real remarkable difference between day of the week, a bit of a drop on the weekends perhaps. The average number of conversations we had was about 34 per day. And the average conversation lasted for about 10 turns, and the average message in these overall was about 76 words per message. So you see that when we launched it, we did kind of a soft launch, then a hard launch, where you see that peak of about almost 2,000 conversations in 1 month, and then it kind of steadily kind of goes on from there. Conversations by day of the week, a little bit of a drop off on the weekends, but nothing too spectacular. This is kind of interesting here. You'll notice that on the far right, it kind of jumps back up because we're binning them between like 11 and 20 and 21 to 40 and so on. So we get kind of a binning effect. But the basic idea here is that we have and that number one there is just noise you can ignore. That just means that the chatbot greeted the person 1,000 times and got no reply. And in the cases where the person did reply, then we get to 3 messages automatically. So that 3 message count of 3,852 is the most is representative of what happens when people ask a question, they get an answer, and then they essentially hang up. So we don't have a lot of data of how they then responded to the chatbot's answer in those cases, but we did have a lot of people do that. I think you see it kind of like gradually tails off in a curve. Now, getting into topic analysis is kind of interesting because there's 2 types of general approaches to topic analysis. One is extrinsic and one is intrinsic. So in an extrinsic methodology, if each of those dots represents a different topic, you might kind of roughly divide them into different, very human understandable categories like doctrine or worship or pastoral care requests or things like this. And when you do that, you have a high degree of explainability. It's very easy to understand the category when you are assigning it extrinsically. But in intrinsic analysis, what we do is we actually look for where the topics, once they've been encoded into a mathematical space that represents semantic meaning in a geometric space, then you can start to see where they cluster of similar questions being asked topic wise. And then you try to discover what those latent topics might be by seeing what those dots have in common. So one way that we did this was using a intrinsic methodology, using a software package called BERT Topic, a software library, I should say. And we only got kind of meh results. And it's probably because it's a general purpose embedding model that we used. We tried a couple different ones, but we had the most success with OpenAI's embedding text 3 large model, it's called. And we found it a little tricky to sort of discover what these different topics are. So topic 0, what's the difference between the Anglican Church and the Episcopal Church? Can it receive communion? Is the propensity for acting in prophetic manner driving the canonically illegal practice of giving communion to unbaptized persons? These are topics that are clearly doctrinal in nature and theological. But then you try to distinguish that from topic 1, where, is it ethical for a Christian to use AI? What is right one? What is a canon? These are questions that are sort of more factual in character, perhaps, and are about maybe practices of the church, perhaps. So you see that it can be a little difficult to separate these topics sometimes. And also just we didn't get a lot of differentiation. Like if I go back, you see that pie chart, the vast number of the conversations that we analyzed, the messages that we analyzed fell into topic 0, which are kind of vaguely the doctrine and religious questions. And that kind of makes sense because if you think of all the possible topics in the world, religion is just kind of one corner of that space. So it's not surprising that a general purpose embedding model would tend to struggle with the resolution of religious topics. And I think that to fix this, probably what we're going to have to do is to fine tune a embedding model specifically on religious conversations. But what about extrinsic topic analysis, where we assign the categories from outside? There we actually get a better result, I think. So this is extrinsic topic analysis using an LLM and using these different categories here. So let me go back, sorry, slide. So if I zoom in on this one, for example, you can see the topics, things like beliefs and doctrines, conversational turn-keeping, like hello, goodbye, thank you, ethics, governance, history, meta questions like who made you, preaching, scripture, spirituality, pastoral care, worship, and practice. You're starting to get a much more even distribution. So These are some examples of what that analysis looked like. Again, we just used an LLM, in this case 4.1 GPT 4.1 Nano, and the number one question that we got here was who is God, who is Jesus, what is the nature of the Trinity, I think was the full version of that one. And you can see that the confidence distribution is that there were a good number of conversations on the left here that clearly did not match this topic. And then we have a fair number that actually do match this topic. In this analysis, what we were doing is we were testing how good each of these categories fits each individual message. So one message could actually fit into more than one category if it was a question that was about both say worship and about doctrine at the same time. That's fine. It could be both of those things. For the purposes of this graph here, I actually made it do best fit. So it actually shoved each individual message into one category or another. But for the purposes of these graphs over here, to see how well we were getting differentiation of topics, I had to do a confidence analysis where it matched with each individual topic to each individual message, which is something that takes quite a long time to compute, which is why we needed a front end that could do that kind of analysis. We put in, as part of the prompt, we also had examples of, so it's actually a multi-shot prompt to give it the best possible chance of understanding what we meant when we said preaching. So like in the preaching questions, example questions might be, write out the entire sermon for Easter, or write out a sermon on John 3:16, or create a sermon, and so forth. And you see we got those matches. These seem to really have a good coherence between the what we were looking for and what the LLM discovered in its analysis of the topics. So people are asking about a broad range of topics. How are they feeling about it? The gray color there in each of these sentiment models represents neutral. So not surprisingly, a lot of the messages just simply had no emotional content that was really apparent. But then you have some that did. And distill the Roberta Go emotions model, which is to me one of the most interesting ones because it has all these different fun categories like annoyance and surprise and so on. The biggest category that it found here, this kind of teal colored one, that's the curiosity one. So that's just discovering the emotional content of curiosity, which is not surprising when we kind of market it as Cathy as a way for people to get questions answered about the Episcopal Church. When we developed a rubric for assessing learning, we did so with 6 axes of possible evidence, such as change of perspective, knowledge confirmation, reframing and interpretation, emotional response to insight, such as gratitude, hope, relief, etc., articulation of application, that's when the user stated how they would apply the insight that they got from the Cathy conversation to real life, questioning and curiosity, and so forth. So did we find learning? Yes. In about... you see on the far right there, we had a fairly high degree of conversations that showed one kind of learning or another. Now, I will say these are conversations that had more than 3 messages in them. So this would have been 5-turn conversations at least. So in other words, these are conversations in which a user asked a question, got a reply, and then said something in response. So that gave us a chance to assess whether learning happened. The most common evidence that we detected was a change of perspective, followed by knowledge confirmation, questioning and curiosity, reframing or interpretation, articulation of application, emotional response to insight, and so on down the list. So that change of perspective was the one we saw the most, where somebody was expressed to some degree that they changed their mind or they were surprised by something. We wanted to understand whether using a more structural approach to these conversations would lead to some discoveries about what kinds of patterns emerge in the back and forths that would understand when learning happens or when it doesn't. So those with more of a mathematical point of view might recognize this mathematical concept here as being what as a Markov chain looks like. But basically, we mapped each conversation as a series of states that flowed from one state to another. So, for example, almost every conversation started with some kind of a question and then transitioned from there to the response in the format of an attempt to inform the other partner of the conversation about 70% of the time. So that was really common. And then about 59% of the time, that ended up with an effort to ask a follow-up question. But that's not always the case. We see how There were other kinds of things that happened, including belligerence occasionally. And in the case of belligerence, it looks like about 20% of the time that was followed up by a response that was meant to console the other. Like, I'm sorry you feel that way was probably the most common one. But the belligerence, most common response to belligerence was actually 53% of the time was an effort to inform. I think the chatbot by default, when somebody said something rude, would say something like, I'm sorry, I'm here to help you understand the Episcopal Church. So it's trying to inform and console at the same time. So that was just kind of a baseline. The high confidence of learning um, conversations looked more like this. So you see it's a somewhat simpler, right? Like you're starting to see a kind of simpler distribution of the conversation pattern. Okay. And then when we just narrow it down to change of perspective conversations, so these are conversations which were marked by a high degree of confidence that change of perspective had happened. There you see an even simpler thing, and you see what's really happening here is a very strong inclination toward this axis of question and followed by an effort to inform, and back and forth. And sometimes contradiction followed by application, sometimes belligerence by social interaction. But basically, there is an emergent pattern where certain kinds of learning conversations seem to have certain patterns evident in them. So that's definitely something that further inquiry could be done about. So another thing that we could do with the Ask Cathy system Tay's tools system that we developed to look at the Ask Cathy conversations was look at individual conversation threads. And this was an example, and I'm just going to kind of breeze through it and not go through every response, but you can pause the video if you want to. But basically, this user started by asking the question, is the Episcopal Church woke? And the chatbot quite rightly answered that, woke has different connotations, and what do you mean by that? And so then the person started asking if it was socialist, and then starts going on from there. Okay, and then it gets into some really interesting stuff here where you start to get it starts to get into a back and forth about climate change. And it's probably a mistake to try to argue with a robot about climate change because it's going to have lots of wonderful evidence on hand. So it started talking about greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what's interesting there is the person asked to prove, how do we know that it's actually carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? And the chatbot responded by talking about ice core samples in the Arctic and how you can find out what the level of carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere 10,000 years ago. And then the conversation shifts in tone, and you get to this: are non-woke people welcome in the Episcopal Church? And then the person starts talking about how they didn't feel it was fair that Hillary supporters got a letter of comfort from the bishops. And so, at this point, you're seeing much more emotional content. You see that a change of perspective is maybe happening, or a change of thing. So you're getting this language about like hate. Why does the Episcopal Church hate these people? And then here you get the real stuff. As a conservative, I don't feel safe in the Episcopal Church. Do you have any guidance for me? You see, this is like real learning. This person is actually going through some kind of a process here of discovery. And so the assistant, role here, the chatbot says, "I'm sorry to hear that you don't feel that," and starts to talk more. And then the person asks, "What should I do if the priest brings up divisive politics in his sermon?" And the chatbot gives some great advice here about how the person should be patient and should wait maybe a week before confronting the priest about what they preached, and should try to see it from the priest's perspective and be non-confrontational and all this wonderful stuff. So I definitely think that in these conversations we can see real spiritual learning and development happening. So yes, learning's happening. Yes, we can use techniques from computational linguistics to characterize this learning and to isolate those examples. And yes, we could definitely use some more efforts to refine those techniques. So that was my my presentation. If people wanted to get in contact with me, I gave them my phone number and my email address. And this was the presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you very much.